You're listening to episode number 114 of the Transform Your Life from the Inside Out podcast. In this episode, I talk about self-worth, self-esteem, and self-acceptance. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Jim Fortin, and you're about to start transforming your life from the inside out with this podcast. I'm widely considered the leader in subconscious transformation, and I've coached super achievers all around the world for over 25 years. Here, you're going to find no rah-rah motivation and no hype, because this podcast is a combination of brain science, transformational psychology, and ancient wisdom all rolled into one to take your life to levels you've never thought possible. If you're wanting a lot more in life, to feel better, to heal, to have peace of mind, to feel powerful and alive, and to bring more abundance and prosperity into your life, then this podcast is for you, because you're going to start learning how to master your mind and evolve your consciousness. And when you do that, anything you want then becomes possible for you. I'm glad you're here. Okay, so self-worth, self-esteem, and self-acceptance. These are literally big stumbling blocks for, and I'm a little careful with my words here, but I'm thinking, and done this for a lot of years, they're big stumbling blocks for a lot of people. Let me give you a couple of examples here, and let me back up first, is that people so badly, they want the approval and the acceptance of other people. As you've heard me say before, people, when it comes down to people, their two biggest fears are, it's either the fear of abandonment, are people going to reject me, or it's the fear of inadequacy, and that would be I'm not good enough. What I want to point out is that both of those also depend upon something external in your life. I mean, if you're afraid of being rejected, that's something external. That's somebody outside of you rejecting you, whether it be friends, family, whoever. And the fear of inadequacy is also about not being good enough, being inadequate. But I want you to notice it's about being inadequate compared to other people. A couple of people that I know them very well. I'll just share some stories here. One of my friends, I've also coached him, but one of my friends is very, very successful, has a really big social media following, built an extremely, by anybody's standards, an extremely successful company. I watch him struggle quite a bit with wanting people to like him. I notice in conversations when we're around people that a lot of what he does, and he didn't recognize that he's doing this, but he'll do it so other people will like him and other people will approve of him. The reason why is because even though you could look at him and you could say, well, you know what? I mean, this guy's got everything. He's got money and relationships and all this kind of stuff. But the reason why, as I was alluding to, is that inside of himself, some of him feels like, you know what? I just have to do things for people so that people will like me. And I see him quite often doing things for people, not to simply do things for people, but to do things for people so that people in kind will like him in return. Another friend of mine, and I've never said anything to either of these two friends, I see him also name dropping a lot on Instagram and Facebook. And he has the good fortune also to know a lot of people, a lot of very successful people, and the people that he knows are a lot of internet personalities. And they know a lot of people that are, kind of celebrity level, people that are known here and there in different industries. And my friend will often name drop, just gratuitously on Instagram. And to give you an example, is recently he was traveling to see one of his friends who's well known. And he said, well, I'm going to so-and-so to see, XYZ, or I'm going to XYZ place. And somebody said, hey, what are you doing there? And he goes, oh, I'm seeing my friend, Joe Smith. And what he could have just said is, I'm going to see friends. But he had to drop the name. Now, when I mentioned, had to drop the name, of course, that could be, isolated, and he did it once, but it's constant. He's constantly dropping names. And he does that because he has perhaps a lack of self-worth, a lack of self-esteem. He wants people to like him, self-value. And he's doing it without even recognizing that he's doing it, because he knows that if he does that, that'll give him, some social prestige, And people will say things about him. Oh, you know what? John is hanging out with so and so this weekend, and this person and that person. And he's doing it all because, plain and simple, is he wants people to like him. And the two people that I just explained to you, in and of themselves, they're very likable people. They're wonderful people. I mean, one more than the other, but one of them has like an amazing, amazing, amazing heart. And he's very giving and very loving, but yet he becomes a little bit of a challenge to be around sometimes because he wants to be liked so badly that he tries so hard that it's not always air quote natural to be around him. I remember watching an episode of 60 Minutes last year, and they had Paul McCartney on. And one of the final questions, they were kind of doing interview style at the end, and one of the questions was, what's your biggest fear? And Paul McCartney said, well, my biggest fear is that people aren't going to like me. And I was so struck by that. Literally, I was just like, what? I mean, come on. Paul McCartney. I mean, who wouldn't like, and of course we have to separate Paul McCartney, the person, from Paul McCartney, the artist. I mean, a global icon. But I thought about it and I'm like, you know what? He would have no problems finding anybody liking him for who he is. And one of his biggest fears is that people are not, I'm laughing here, but that people are not going to like him. As you're listening to me tell these stories, how do you think this applies to you? And does any of it resonate with you? And I can tell you at this point in my life, and it's specifically because I've worked with a shaman for so many years, is that it doesn't matter to me whether or not people like me. It doesn't. What, because people are going to like me, some are, some aren't. I can't find my worth and my value in what other people think about me, whether people think very positive things or whether people think negative things. But these people that I'm talking about that I mentioned earlier, I don't know Paul McCartney. I'd love to meet the guy, but I don't know him. The other two guys that I do, but I've coached so many people over the years, and this is so prevalent. And as I'm talking about this, how much of it resonates with you? I mean, how many of you were actually, you're out in the world and you're actually trying to be liked and you're doing things to be liked and you're a pleaser and you bend over backwards because you want people to like and accept you. The reality is people are, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, people are going to like you based upon who you are, not who you're trying to be. But let's look at these very quickly, and I want to give you something in this episode that I got from my brother-in-law, the shaman. I want to share a couple of thoughts with you that I've not shared before that are very profound in my interpretation, and I want to share them with you in this episode that will perhaps help many of you, if not everyone listening, find that self-worth and that self-esteem and that self-acceptance and value in yourself. But very quickly here, because this is not an analytical, educational episode, but self-worth is basically, it's the value that you put on yourself as a human being. It's really, what value, as John Smith or Susan Smith, what value do you have for that human being that is you? And what many of us do is we place our value on ourselves based upon externals. So it's vital. It's so vital that, and by the way, this was a long journey for me. I trust me when I tell you, I know what I'm talking about in this episode. It was a long journey for me finding my own self-worth and my own self-value. And I air quote, arrived at that many years ago, and that's liberation. But I'm going to tell you, it was a journey getting there. But so many of us, because I used to think that I was less than, I'll talk about that a little bit later in this episode. But it's so important that you recognize and you find value in your own worth in yourself as a being. Something that I tell people is the fact that you're on this planet, the fact that you're on the planet means that you're good enough. No matter who you are or what you are or the color of your skin or your sexual orientation or where you live or anything, the fact that you're on the planet means that you're good enough. But most of us were taught our levels of self-worth by what we see in the world and what we learn as kids. I learned, I think, part of my social, I never had issues with my self-worth when it came down to, am I a smart person or not? That was never an issue to me. Am I capable in sports or academics? Those were never issues to me. What used to be an issue to me was, am I as good as other people and do I belong in certain social circles? Now, I learned that from my parents, and especially looking at my dad and watching my dad, because my dad used to always say, we're not like those people, we're not like those people. And what he was conveying to me is that other people, when he would say that, is that other people that had money and that were wealthy were better than what we were in the family that I grew up in. And so for many years, I remember even when I went to college, I went to a small private school, and a lot of my friends were very wealthy. I might have even mentioned on an episode, one of my roommates drove a Mercedes Benz, and I drove an old beat up truck. And I remember thinking, maybe my first week at college, there's a lot of rich kids here. And I didn't think that I had to leave or I didn't belong there, but I used to think, wow, there's a lot of rich kids here, and I've got to fit in. I've got to find a way to fit in. So I just want to share with you that whatever your level of self-worth is, you've learned that. You've also learned it by what your parents said to you as a child. I remember in New York City when I lived there a lot of years ago, I was at some place, I don't know, Burrito Hut or something. I don't know what it was. But this beautiful little girl was standing in front of me, and she's probably 6 years old. I mean, she was just a gorgeous little girl. And she was tugging at her mother's blouse or something, or her mother's purse. And I don't remember all the details, but I remember what was said. Like it was just burned into my memory. But this little girl was trying to get her mother's attention, and the mother said, you know what? You're just more trouble than you're worth. Or something along those lines, but it all came down to self-worth. And the little girl got very quiet and kind of just turned away from her mother. And you might have heard me say before is that we learn to become who we are before the age of about 8 years old. And when I saw that, it was devastating to me because I'm like, what did she just teach? What did she just implant in that little girl's unconscious mind? And I have to tell you, I've alluded to that a little bit on this episode, is I watch people in my transformational programs, and so many come in with such a lack of worth and value on themselves. Okay, self-esteem is basically how much you like yourself. You know, what do you think about yourself aside from the self-worth as a being? But basically, our self-esteem comes down to our levels of competence. And it can also be appraisals about ourselves. It can be appraisals about our looks, our body, our skills, our appearance, our behaviors. You know, it can be, for example, I can't run as fast as Bobby, or I can't do something as well as Susan can. And then we start feeling bad about ourselves because we can't do something as well as what someone else can do. But you know what I want to share with you, and I see a lot of this in people, but what I want to share is there are many things. I can't even fathom the number. There are many things that I cannot do well, and other people can do much, much better than what I can do with those things. But what I do know is what I can do well is I can deliver content like in this podcast. It's one thing that I can do very well. When it comes to behavioral change, I can do core level, deep level, subconscious change with my clients and students and people that I'm working with in my groups very, very well. I would honestly say, and I mean this humbly, that I'm probably one of the best people in the world at what I do. There is no one on this planet that can marry subconscious reprogramming like hypnosis and habit change and spirituality. There is no one on this planet that can marry the ancient wisdom and the spirituality and the subconscious reprogramming and the neurolinguistics and the habit change at a brain-based level like I can, and I know that and I own that. Why? Couple of reasons. One, I have evidence of it, but secondly, I've just done it for so many years and I've seen the results. But the reason that I share that with you is comparing myself to others. There are many things that I cannot do well. And what I want to share with you is I don't feel bad about myself because I can't do certain things as well as other people. A lot of things not as well as other people. You know, Albert Einstein said something along the lines, I'm gonna mess this up, but he said something along the lines of like everyone is a genius. And again, I'm really gonna mess this up, but he said something like everyone's a genius. But the gist of it was is you can't teach a fish to climb a tree. And you know what? I'm sure there are things, and people don't even recognize, and it takes them years, many times. There are things that you're amazing at, and there are even things that you want to share with the world, but you don't because of judgment or your self-worth about yourself, or you know what is I can't do it as good as I can't do it as well as other people. And that's so ironic to me when you look at people and the subjectiveness they place on themselves about not being able to do something well. I mean, for crying out loud, Picasso's paintings are some of the most famous paintings in the world, and he used to paint a woman's face on this, two faces on the same side of her head. I mean, come on. I mean, that's not real. That's not symmetrical. That's not real life. But yet, the guy is one of the most famous painters in the world. Okay, and then let's go to self-acceptance. Self-acceptance is accepting who you are. And I had a big journey to that, which I'm not going to go into in this podcast. But I remember one time when I lived in New York City, a gentleman that I got to know very well, he had called me and he wanted me to help him with some self-hypnosis. And we ended up at his office at Rockefeller Center. Very, very, very wealthy man. He was a Venezuelan oil man. And I remember telling a friend later, I said, you know what? Well, actually, the first day that I was with him, working with him, his phone rang, and it was his cell phone, and I could hear the whole conversation. And it was he and the President of the United States talking about what they were going to do for Thanksgiving. Their families were going to get together. And me being the little small town Texas farm boy, I mean Podunk, USA, small town farm boy, I immediately went gulp. It's like, what am I doing? I mean, what am I doing at Rockefeller Center talking to this person? This person is asking me for help, and I ain't nobody. I'm just a small town Texas farm boy. And I remember that I got home that night and I called a friend of mine from college and we were chatting and I told him about this. And he said, no, Jim. He goes, you are good enough. You're good enough to be there because guess what? If you weren't good enough, you would not have been called and been there in the first place. Now, I'm talking about acceptance. I had to accept that, you know what? I am good enough. I can play in the A-League. So, by the way, I'm sharing all my secrets with you guys and all of my stuff. But, look at yourself, and you first have to accept yourself, because you already know, I've done episodes on this, is that people will judge you. People, no matter how great you are at something, if you're white, some people will judge you in some ways. If you're black, people will judge you in a different way. If you're, Asian, people will judge you in a different way. If you're Indian, people, even though you can do the same behavior as everyone else in some way, people will judge you differently because you're Indian or Chinese or black or gay or straight or Jewish or college educated or not college educated. If you take a particular task or skill and you are world class at it, people will judge you based upon their observations and interpretations about the person doing the world class skill. And that's why I tell you that you've got to accept who you are. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about self-worth, self-esteem, and self-acceptance. And these are all, there's a Texas phrase that I love, and it's called slippery as a minnow. A minnow is that little bitty fish, you try to pick it up and it always slips out of your hands. But these are all things because people are like, well, how do I have self-worth? How do I have self-esteem? How do I have self-acceptance? I remember, and as I told you, this just popped in my mind. When it says I told you, I don't make notes. I just sit down and I go, and what needs to come through me will come through me for these episodes. I remember watching Sarah Ferguson on Oprah's Masterclass. Sarah Ferguson was married to Prince Andrew. I mean, she was the daughter-in-law of Queen Elizabeth. And on this Masterclass episode, she said, because this is why, in her interpretation, she battled with her weight for so many years, is that she was dealing with, I don't remember what it was, but it's along these lines of self-love, self-worth, self-acceptance. And I remember her asking in that episode, but how? I've been looking for somebody to teach me how to have self-worth. And you probably know by now is, in the time that you've been with me, is that working with a shaman, I work from a cosmological point of view. I work from a point of view is that you are a cosmic being that's currently having a human experience. You've heard me say before that you were somewhere before you got into this body. before you incarnated, and then once you leave this body, you're going to go somewhere else in the universe because you're an energetic being which can never be destroyed. Call that your soul, your double, whatever it is that you want to call it. But I want to share something with you that my brother-in-law gave to me, something he said to me. It was written down. He gave this to me back in 2007. And I want to read something to you. I might kind of fumble through this a little bit. I want to read it and then come back and visit with you about it. But he said to me, "You're everything, and at the same time, you are nothing. You are everything that you know of this universe, which is infinite. Everything that you know comes through your diminutive being. It's all that you are. You're a being full of defects, and this should not shame you. When you accept your own self, you are then in your own personal integrity, and only when you're in it do you stop having fear to what you are, and you can continue advancing." In layman's terms, obviously that means that you listening right now, you are everything that you know of the universe. And everything that you know of the universe will come through you, which is this diminutive being. And this diminutive being is this bag of, I call it bag of skin, this bag of bones, this, carbon, this matter that you are, is diminutive compared to the infiniteness of the universe. I mean, literally, you're just this little bitty times 100 times 1,000 times 1,000,000,000 human being in this infinite universe. And yes, you're full of defects, but you know what? You shouldn't be shameful about that. Just accept that that's who you are. And when you accept that's who you are, now you're in integrity with who you are. You have no reason to be fearful of who you are. And then notice what I said last. And then you can continue advancing, meaning growing, because we don't grow when we don't accept who we are. As a matter of fact, you've heard me mention and use the word toxicity. By not accepting who you are, you're literally living like in this pit of toxicity, this pool of toxicity. And how is it possible to grow when you're swimming and drowning in a pool of toxicity? My point here is this, is that you're good enough. Right now, no matter who you are, where you are good enough right now. Because the takeaway that I just gave you from what I shared with you, what was given to me, is you can't grow. You cannot grow while you're hating on yourself. You cannot create and you cannot advance while you're denigrating yourself and tearing yourself down and putting yourself down. And consider that. How can you create? Let's say that you have this extraordinary gift as an artist. How can you create when you're constantly putting yourself down and tearing yourself down and comparing yourself to other people? You cannot, because what needs to come through you will not come through you. Now, as I said, and I gave you the story a little earlier, is that reminds me, because I grew up, just let me segue here for a moment, is my father always used to say to me as a kid, he always used to say, "Hurry up, spit it out. No one wants to hear what you have to say." And I went through a large part of my life believing that what I had to say wasn't of any value and that I didn't have anything worthy to say. And even though for many, many years, as I look back, I've always had things to say that can help people. Let me put it that way, that can help people. But I didn't say things for many years because I didn't believe that I was valuable enough to say those things. I was talking to my brother-in-law one time. I was with him after an evening, and he said to me, because there's a famous author named Wayne Dyer who asked me to meet my brother-in-law, the shaman, that I've worked with for a lot of years. And my brother-in-law said to me, he goes, "How come people because my brother-in-law's work, by the way, I'm not gonna mention a name, has been ghostwritten. Somebody ghostwrote his life story, and it's become iconic. As I've mentioned before, it's literally globally famous work. But my brother-in-law is the person behind the work. Somebody ghostwrote it, but my brother-in-law works as a healer, and that's what he does. He works with people that want to grow spiritually and people that need to heal physically. But he said to me, he goes, "How come Wayne Dyer is out there talking about things that I help people with. And people like Deepak Chopra talk about the work that was written about me. And you're my brother-in-law and you're my apprentice, but you're not out there talking about it. And he goes, you know me, they don't, and they're talking about it and you're not. Now, I don't know if that's a matter of me not feeling worthy, but I'll tell you how I definitely felt is that I felt that I needed to become more. I needed to be more before I could go out and share in the world. And that coupled with my father always saying that, no one wants to hear what you have to say, I had a deep held belief that I was lesser than other people and there were not valuable things coming out of me. But let's use this podcast as an example. In 1 year, we're at 1 million, like 13 months, we're at 1 million downloads in 13 months. I mean, it's astronomical. So in this day and age, I do believe and I do know that I have very valuable things that can help you grow your life. I know that these things are inside of me. People, which unfortunately I can't answer because I can't get to them, but on Facebook, people DM all the time. I don't check my own Facebook. I don't check my own Instagram. My team does it and everything for me. But constantly we're getting emails from people saying, thank you, the podcast changed my life. Well, if that doesn't show me that there are things in me that are valuable and things that can change people's lives, then nothing will. But here's the thing. I'm not at that point anymore. I'm at the point where I recognize my value, but I also want to share is I don't get into, air quote, I don't get into my value. I simply know that I'm going to go out and I'm going to share what I want to share in the world. Some will like it, some won't. Some will call me names. Some will say some very derogatory things about me. Some will criticize me. Some will castigate me. Some will resonate. Some will like it. Some will say, hey, Jim, you changed my life. I can't control that. I don't watch a lot of TV. But I recently watched on Netflix David Letterman. I think it's a little episode called Like My Guest Needs No Introduction. And he had Ellen on there. And Ellen was talking about when she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama. She had said, she goes, I didn't know what it was when I heard I was going to get it, but definitely, I wanted to get it. And she goes, and she was crying on Letterman. This was so powerful. And she goes, because I never saw myself as a valuable person. Now, this day and age, millions and millions and millions of people look up to her for her kindness and things that she does for people. But even though all these things that she did for other people, she couldn't see her own value in herself. And what I want you to look at is look at your heart. Are you out there in the world serving and doing things and helping people, but you can't even see that on, that value in yourself? And she even was crying. She was saying to David Letterman, even you having me on this particular show shows me, and I'm paraphrasing here, but shows me that you see something in me that I haven't seen in myself. Because, see, she saw herself as less than. And especially when she came out and her TV episode was canceled back in the 90s. I've never seen an episode. I went 10 years without a TV. I've never seen an episode. But society was telling her, because you're gay, you are less than. And her episode was canceled and she was shunned for like 3 years or 4 years or something in the entertainment industry. And now she's one of the most well-known personalities in the world. But winning the Presidential Medal of Freedom and being on Letterman literally confirmed for her and showed her that she did have worth in herself that she didn't know that she had. So again, what I want to share with you is that you're good enough exactly as you are. But what we tend to do, which I used to do, is we used to say, oh, because a certain person lives in a, which is the way that I learned about worth, is because a certain person lives in a certain neighborhood, they're better than I am. Because a certain person actually can do something better, now this wasn't mine, but it might be yours, because they can paint better or dance better or sing better, then guess what? They're better than I am. And when I look at singing, for example, people will say, well, somebody else can sing better than I can, so I shouldn't try it. One of the most well-known singers in the world, he literally was the entertainment at Bill Gates' wedding, is Willie Nelson. Now, and only in my opinion, I do like Willie's music. I do want to point out, and I played golf at his golf course many times. He lives in Austin, Texas, and we have mutual friends. But it's been many years ago that I used to play golf at his golf course. He has a golf course on his property. But what I want to point out is I don't think by any stretch of the imagination, if you were to compare Willie Nelson and let's say, I don't know, Pavarotti or John Denver or Elvis, they're not in the same level of voice quality in my interpretation. But guess what? If Willie Nelson ever said, you know what, I can't sing because my voice doesn't sound like Elvis or doesn't have the sweetness like Elvis, therefore I can't sing, well, where would that have gotten him? I'm using a lot of TV analogies tonight. I tell you, one of my favorite TV shows, and I'm joking here when I say no judging, but I like it for the cultural references to it. I like it because it was cutting edge. I've not really become the cattle, not the cattle, but the cage rattler that I am. I mean, I'm one of those people. It's my job to wake people up in life, and I love rattling the cage. But to me, I'm attracted to things and people in life that rattle the cage. When people do things to make other people wake up. And going back to TV here, one of my favorite TV shows, which I could watch over the episodes over and over again, and I know a lot of them by heart, is All in the Family with Archie Bunker. Talk about a lesson and literally putting something out there. I mean, that show was groundbreaking for the 1970s, and I mean groundbreaking. And it's so groundbreaking that even today, there are certain words in the episode that are actually bleeped out today, but they were on live TV back in the 70s. And in one of the first episodes, Sammy Davis Jr. was a guest on the show. And if you've ever watched All in the Family, Archie was a very kind-hearted, very loving person, but yet a very small-minded, very bigoted person. And he believed that things like the races should be separated. I mean, he even said that in the episode. He even said just watch. You can go to YouTube and actually just for fun because it's a really hysterical episode in my opinion. But it's just you can look for All in the Family, Sammy Davis Jr. and watch the entire episode, and you'll literally hear what I'm going to share with you in this podcast episode. But Archie looked down on people, especially people that were Jewish, and as he would call them, colored, African Americans, black, whichever word you choose. And Sammy Davis Jr. late in the episode looked at Archie, and he said, and there was other dialogue prior, but he said to Archie in a very, actually, it was a very satirical way, which Archie wasn't smart enough to pick up on it. But Sammy Davis Jr. said, "You ain't better than anybody." Now Archie thought that was a compliment, and he's like, "Can I have your hand on that, Sammy?" He thought he's being complimented because his kid and his daughter and son-in-law were always telling him that he was racist and he's prejudiced. Now, again, go watch the episode if you want, but my whole elongated point here is that you, listening, you ain't better than anybody. Neither am I. We tend to look at the world and we tend to think that we're better than someone else because we have different social standing. We have different money. We have different this. We have different that. And we might even in society value those things more. But as a human being, it doesn't make you better than anyone. I remember in New York City, I won't go into a long story here, but there's this homeless guy when I lived on the Upper East Side, and on that side of town, there are very few homeless people on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. It's the wealthy, well, there's a level of wealth all over Manhattan, but that's the wealthy Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, etc. part of town. And I lived there, which by the way, in my opinion, it's also the most boring part of town. People call it white bread because it's so boring. There's no diversity, no nothing. I mean, it's just rich people, so to speak. But there was a homeless guy, and I remember one day that I won't go into the long story, but it's a really fascinating story. But he and I just sat out on the curb and talked for hours. And he pointed up the street to me, and he said, "You see that planter up there?" And he was blind, by the way. I mean, can you imagine that, being homeless on the streets of New York and being blind? And he goes, "You see that planter?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I do." And he goes, "I built that planter in 1968. And his story is that he used to be a superintendent on that block back in the 60s, and he was sighted. He got glaucoma and he lost his sight. And he wasn't, by the way, in case you're wondering, he wasn't in a shelter because he goes, people rob you and they take your money and everything in a shelter. It's safer for me to be on the streets of the Upper East Side. My point is this: a very loving, very kind kind individual. And I helped him as long as I lived on the Upper East Side. I'd make sure that he was warm when it was cold outside, and I'd bring him food and give him money and clothes and sweatshirts and blankets and all kinds of things. But my point is, when I was sitting there talking to him, his name was Joey. And Joey and I would just talk, and I wasn't any better than Joey, and Joey wasn't any better than me. We simply were just two human beings sitting there sharing our lives and talking together. Okay, this episode is, I want to share this with you. So many of you guys, you want steps. Give me 3 steps to change this or to change that, or 4 steps to do this or to do that. I've learned in shamanism, working with a shaman, that it's not always about steps. It's about becoming and doing and just automatically stepping into something. You have the power to shift anything in your life in an instant. What I want you to get is there's no steps to this. I've mentioned before about happiness. People will say, well, what are the steps to being happy? Unfortunately, the way to be happy is first to be happy. And that's the unfortunate conundrum, is people want steps and ways, and the way to be happy is to be happy. But here's what I want to share with you, is that if you don't accept that you're good enough right now, if you don't accept, based upon everything you just heard me say, that you're good enough right now as you are, then when? When are you going to be good enough? Because you're never, ever going to be good enough. Full transparency. Are there people that might snarl and look down on me? Yeah, I'm sure there are. Are there people that might judge and criticize me? Yes, I'm sure there are. No question about it. But all that I know is that I'm on the planet to serve, and I'm on the planet to grow, and that's all that I can do, and that's all that I can be. And the same thing comes down to you as well. People are going to look down their noses at you, and they're going to judge you and criticize you and castigate you and all these things. But just please know, whether or not you even believe it, it doesn't even matter if you believe it. It doesn't. But what I want you to fully get, at least, is that you're good enough right now. You're good enough right now. And your transformational takeaway is this: I'm good enough as I am. Because remember, if you weren't good enough, you wouldn't be on the planet. Or let me reverse that. And yeah, that's a whole rabbit hole right there, but let me go a different direction. The fact that you are on the planet means that you're good enough to be on the planet. Okay, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you over on the next episode. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this entire podcast. If you're the kind of person who likes to help others, then share this with your friends and family. You know, if you found value, they will too. So please share via your social media channels. Also, if you have questions, I'm here to assist. You can email me questions to support@jimfortin.com, and I may even use your question for a future podcast episode. Also, if you want transformational content like this daily, connect with me on Instagram. My Instagram name is I am Jim Fortin. Finally, I do have a personal request. I believe that we're all here to help others and to grow and evolve ourselves. Together, you and I, let's help more people. If you would please leave a review on iTunes, and a good one, by the way. I'd be grateful, and through your assistance together, we can transform more lives. Thanks for listening.